In early November 1887, the residents of Dakota Territory witnessed something extraordinary. Ole Hanssen, a Norwegian immigrant at his homestead for just 3 years, was doing something inexplicable. Every evening, his neighbors observed him carrying heated stones from a fire pit, wrapping them in burlap, and lowering them through an opening in his cabin floor. The stones glowed orange-red as they disappeared into the earth, yet Ole never seemed to struggle with fuel the way other families did. When neighbors gathered at the general store, a man named Henrik Petersen spoke with skepticism. "The man buries stones like they are the bones of his ancestors," Henrik said. "He thinks rocks will heat his cabin. By January, we will see him freezing like everyone else." His words were met with knowing nods and laughter. What these neighbors didn't understand was that Ole wasn't inventing something new. He was reviving something ancient, something that had kept his family alive through brutal Scandinavian winters for 7 generations. They didn't understand that thermal mass doesn't care about skepticism, and if you want to find out what happened when that Arctic front swept across Dakota Territory and temperatures plummeted to levels that had never been recorded before, subscribe now, because what Ole's neighbors witnessed next would change everything they thought they knew about survival, engineering, and the power of inherited knowledge. Ole Hanssen was born in 1851 in Hamar, a village in Innlandet County, eastern Norway, where winters were so severe they had shaped life for over 1,000 years. His father Soren had worked as a stone craftsman, as had his grandfather before him. The Hanssen family had been stonemasons for at least 12 generations, working with granite and basalt, understanding stone in a way few moderns could. Their technique wasn't mystical. It was born from desperation and observation, from watching what worked when temperatures dropped 50 degrees below zero. His grandmother Ingrid raised Ole after his mother died from pneumonia when he was 5. Ingrid lived to 93 and, in Ole's childhood, would lead him down stone stairs beneath their family home to the varmerom, the heat room, built into the walls of their house. "Ole," Ingrid would say in Norwegian, "you are a Hanssen, and the Hanssens know something others take a lifetime to learn. Heat sleeps in stone. Most think heat only exists in fire, in burning. But heat can be saved, stored like grain in a barrel. When you heat stone to the right temperature, it remembers that heat for hours, gives it back slowly, like a gift that keeps giving." She would lead him down to the large granite rocks in the chamber beneath their house. "Feel the warmth still coming from the stones, hours after the fire finished," she would say, placing his hand on the warm surface. "This is the wisdom of the mountains. This kept our family alive when snow reached our roofs. This will keep you alive when you are a man, wherever you find yourself." These childhood lessons would prove more valuable than any gold when Ole faced impossible circumstances in his new land. In 1884, at 33, Ole made the decision that changed his life. The Industrial Revolution had brought economic hardship to traditional craftsmen. The quarrying companies were replacing skilled stoneworkers with machines and cheaper labor. Ole, a skilled craftsman in a country that no longer valued his skills, faced a declining future. He had a wife named Astrid, a daughter Margaret, 7, and a son, Anders, 5. The Homestead Act offered 160 acres for anyone willing to farm it 5 years. In April 1884, the Hanssen family boarded the ship Elaine in Oslo, crowded with Norwegian and Swedish families seeking the same dream. The 3-week Atlantic voyage was difficult. Astrid feared the sea while Ole stood on deck, thinking of his grandmother's words, "Wherever you find yourself, you have the knowledge of stone that cannot be taken from you." He was terrified and exhilarated in equal measure, knowing this enormous risk was his family's only hope. They arrived in New York in May 1884 and made their way west by rail to Stanley County in Dakota Territory. The landscape shocked them. There were no mountains, no forests, only endless, flat prairie. Astrid wept, convinced they had made a terrible mistake. But Ole saw possibility in land, waiting to be transformed. The government assigned him 160 acres. He began building from nothing, cutting sod in summer to construct a small house. Winter came sooner than expected. A neighbor named Joseph warned him, "You cannot imagine the cold here. The wind blows down from Canada with nothing to stop it. People have frozen to death between cabins and barns." That first winter, 1884 to 1885, was difficult but bearable. The sod house's thick earthen walls held warmth surprisingly well. Ole kept a fire burning constantly, and though the corners were always cold, the family survived. Astrid and the children adapted slowly, but they lived through it. In spring 1885, Ole reflected on the constant cold and endless fuel struggle. He realized the sod house offered only bare shelter. Next winter would be worse. He needed to build what his grandmother Ingrid had taught him: thermal mass heating. In summer 1885, he began construction on a proper log cabin with a floor, roof, and windows. Alongside it, he began the ambitious work of creating an underground thermal heating system, using his grandmother's principles and his family's stonemason skills. But life had other plans, as it so often does. In early 1886, just as Ole was completing the cabin, just as he was beginning to feel like the worst of the struggle might be behind him, his wife Astrid contracted influenza. The illness came suddenly during a cold snap in February, when the temperature dropped so low that the thermometer outside the window froze solid at the bottom. Influenza was not an abstract threat on the frontier. It was a killer. And in the conditions of a small cabin in winter, with inadequate nutrition and no medical care beyond folk remedies, it was often a death sentence. Despite everything Ole tried, riding into town to fetch the doctor, who made the long journey out to the homestead and could offer only general advice and sympathy, keeping her warm with every blanket they owned, preparing broths and remedies that Astrid's own mother had taught him before he left Norway, she weakened steadily. Her breathing became labored. The cough that had started as something dry and annoying became wet and terrible. Her skin became gray and thin. She died on March 12, 1886, at the age of 29, with her 2 children in the cabin and her husband holding her hand. The doctor said it was probably pneumonia that had followed the influenza, a combination that was almost always fatal in those days. Ole was left alone with 2 children, a newly completed cabin that still needed interior work, and a homestead that required constant work just to maintain. Margaret, who was 9 years old, suddenly had to take on the role of caring for her younger brother Anders, who was 7. Ole fell into a kind of shock, the kind of grief-stricken fog that makes days blur together. He still had to work. There was no choice about that. The animals needed feeding. The land needed attention. The cabin needed to be maintained. But for nearly a year, Ole moved through his days in a kind of numbness, working because there was work to be done, because survival demanded it, but without the joy or hope that had carried him through the difficult early years. He spoke very little. He would work from sunrise to sunset and then sit by the fire in the evening without speaking, staring into the flames, his children playing quietly nearby, giving him the space that grief demands. It was in late 1886, in the autumn, when the county official arrived at his homestead with papers. The man's name was William Caldwell, and he was the county superintendent of schools, and also served as the official responsible for confirming that homestead claims were being properly improved and maintained. He was not an unkind man, but he was serious about his responsibilities. "Mr. Hanssen," he said, holding up the documents that comprised Ole's homestead claim, "your claim is contingent on your demonstrating that you can maintain a suitable dwelling for a family. My inspection shows adequate structure. The cabin itself is well built, and I can see that you have made significant effort here. But there are concerns about your ability to maintain adequate heating and living conditions given your current circumstances." He looked around the cabin, which was clean but austere, with no real furniture beyond what was necessary, no decoration or comfort. What the official was saying, without saying it directly, was that as a widower with 2 young children, the government had questions about whether Ole could survive the winters and properly care for his family. A man alone with 2 children without a wife to help, the official had seen this situation many times, and he had seen it end badly. "I am advising you officially, Mr. Hanssen, that if you do not demonstrate significant improvements to the heating system and overall habitability of your dwelling, particularly as we approach the winter season, there is a possibility that we may need to revisit your claim. The government has a responsibility to ensure that families are living in adequate conditions. I am not making this threat lightly. I have seen children suffer in inadequate housing. I am hoping to prevent that here." The threat was clear, even if it was delivered politely. Ole had to prove not only that he could survive, but that he could thrive, that he could provide a home warm enough and safe enough for his children. Or he could lose everything. He could lose the land that he had worked so hard to improve. He could lose the cabin he had built with his own hands. He could be seen as an unfit father, unable to provide for his children, and the county could potentially remove his children and place them elsewhere. The stakes could not have been higher. This pressure, this existential threat to his family's future, drove Ole to finally implement his grandmother's heating system. The conversation with county official William Caldwell in October 1886 broke through his grief. If he did nothing, he would lose everything: the land, the cabin, his security. Worse, his children might be taken from him. He had to act now. He began in earnest in spring 1887, when the ground thawed in April. By early April, the topsoil was workable. Ole gathered his children, Margaret, now 12, serious and hard-working like her father, and Anders, 9, strong and willing to help. Ole sat them down and explained in Norwegian, "Your great-grandmother Ingrid taught me how to store heat in stone, how to use the knowledge of the mountains to survive the coldest winters. Our family has done this for many generations. It was the secret that kept us alive. No one in Dakota Territory knows this. But we will build something no one on this prairie has ever seen. We will use what the earth gives us and what our family has always known to create heat that will not fail us, no matter how cold the winter becomes. This is how we keep our home. This is how we keep our family safe." Construction began the next day. Ole located a site directly beneath the main cabin and began to dig. The work was backbreaking. He needed to excavate a chamber about 4 feet below ground, 8 feet long and 6 feet wide, with nearly 5 feet height, large enough to crawl into, but not stand upright. Dakota Territory soil is dense and heavy, much denser than European soil. Ole worked from sunrise to sunset with spade and shovel, his hands blistering constantly, his shirt soaked with sweat. Margaret and Anders worked alongside him, hauling excavated earth in buckets, creating human chains to move heavy soil from the pit. As he dug deeper, Ole discovered different layers: dark, loamy earth, rich with prairie grass roots, then clay mixed with rocks, packed tight from compression, then harder clay mixed with gravel, almost like natural concrete. Ole studied these layers carefully, understanding intuitively what modern engineers would later confirm: different soil types have dramatically different thermal properties. The heavy clay, while difficult to dig, would hold heat far better than lighter, porous soil. He positioned his main heating chamber where the clay was thickest and most stable. He lined the bottom with flat rocks gathered from the prairie surface, creating a level base. Then, using skills his father and grandfather had taught him, he carefully built walls around the chamber, using stones held together with clay mixed with water and straw. A technique as old as human civilization itself, the same method ancient peoples used to build dwellings, passed from generation to generation in his family. By late June, after 3 months of labor, the main chamber was complete, a cavity beneath the cabin, lined with stone, ready for heat. Then came the hardest part: building a system to place heated rocks into the chamber while safely radiating heat upward without fire hazards. He installed vented openings in the cabin floor directly above the chamber, with wooden frames and iron grates that could be opened or closed. These allowed warm air to rise while preventing direct flame exposure. He also dug a shaft connecting the chamber to his fireplace, allowing him to lower heated rocks without bringing them directly into the cabin. The engineering was simple, but execution required careful planning. The physical toll was severe. Ole lost nearly 30 pounds, weight his lean frame could not afford to lose. His hands developed massive calluses that constantly split and bled. His back developed constant pain, a grinding ache present from dawn to night. There were days when his back hurt so much he could barely straighten up, but Margaret and Anders worked alongside him every day, learning what it meant to build something that mattered, something that would define their family's place in this new land. They learned to measure, solve problems, and persist through difficulty. When neighbors asked what he was doing, Ole simply said he was improving his cabin's foundation. Few understood, and fewer believed it would make any difference when winter came. By late August, when summer was beginning to fade and autumn was visible on the horizon, the system was finally complete. Ole then turned his attention to the most critical component, creating a reliable and repeatable way to heat rocks to the correct temperature and then safely lower them into the underground chamber each evening. He built a special fire pit near his cabin's side, lined with carefully selected stones that could withstand intense heat without cracking. This fire pit was different from a cooking fire or a heating fire. It was designed specifically to achieve and maintain very high temperatures. He could burn wood in a very hot, concentrated way, hot enough to heat large stones to around 400 degrees Fahrenheit, controlled enough that he could manage it and tend to it safely. Though he didn't think of it in these scientific terms, what he was doing was really about understanding thermal mass and heat transfer, about the physics of how heat moves through materials. The physics is crucial to understanding why Ole's system worked. When you heat a large piece of granite or basalt, the densest stones available on the prairie, to around 400 degrees Fahrenheit or higher, the stone retains that heat for an extraordinarily long time. Unlike water, which cools quickly, stone loses heat slowly through radiation and conduction. A single large granite rock, perhaps weighing 50 or 60 pounds, heated to 400 degrees Fahrenheit will release between 50,000 and 80,000 British thermal units over 8 to 12 hours, depending on stone size, exact temperature, and cabin ambient temperature. Modern heating engineers calculate that a small cabin in extreme climate requires approximately 20 to 30 BTUs per hour per square foot to maintain comfort at minus 42 degrees Fahrenheit. A cabin like Ole's, roughly 400 square feet, would need approximately 8,000 to 12,000 BTUs per hour in extreme cold. Ole's system using 2 or 3 large heated rocks placed in the chamber each evening, generated between 100,000 and 240,000 BTUs per day, more than enough to cover his household's heating needs. A typical cord of firewood produces approximately 24 million BTUs when fully burned, but requires constant feeding into fires throughout day and night, meaning much heat escapes up the chimney as waste. Ole's rock-based system was vastly more efficient, losing heat slowly to the cabin rather than directly to sky. It was, in essence, a thermal battery, storing heat generated during daylight and releasing it slowly throughout the night. The first real test came in early November 1887, when the first significant blizzard swept across Dakota Territory. Snow fell so thick, visibility reduced to a few feet. Temperature dropped to 20 degrees below zero. That night, Ole heated his largest rocks in the fire pit, working quickly before darkness, watching them glow orange-red in firelight. He knew from his grandmother's teachings when they reached the correct temperature, about 400 degrees, though he had no thermometer. He wrapped them carefully in burlap to preserve heat and make them easier to handle. Then, with Margaret helping and Anders watching, he slowly lowered them into the underground chamber through the access shaft. He sealed the opening. He and his children waited, watching, observing, uncertain whether all their labor and struggle would actually produce results. Within an hour, the cabin began to warm in a way that seemed miraculous. Heat radiating from the buried stones was subtle at first, only felt if you put your hand directly over the floor vents. But gradually, it became unmistakable. The cold that had been creeping in through every gap and crack seemed to retreat. The cabin reached a genuinely comfortable temperature, not just barely survivable, but actually warm, genuinely comfortable in a way that no one on this prairie had experienced during winter. Margaret later told the story of sitting by the floor opening that first night, feeling the warm air rising steadily from beneath the earth. She remembered the shock of that warmth in a way that shaped her for the rest of her life. She wondered if perhaps her father had done something miraculous, if he had somehow captured the heat of the sun itself and buried it in the ground beneath their home. Meanwhile, just 200 yards away across the snow, Henrik Pedersen and his family were huddled around a small fire in their cabin, burning through precious wood at an alarming rate, desperately trying to keep the temperature above freezing. The blizzard lasted for 2 days and 2 nights, 48 hours of constant wind and snow. 48 hours during which visibility was minimal and leaving the cabin was literally life-threatening. Henrik worked constantly, cutting wood from his supply, splitting it, feeding it into the fire. His wife, Ingrid, helped. Even the older children helped, carrying wood, tending the fire, feeding it with the desperation of people who understood that the fire was the only thing standing between them and death. And still, the cabin grew colder. The temperature inside never rose above 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and in the bedrooms it actually dropped below freezing. The cold was something almost alive, something that seemed to press against every wall, seeking every gap, every weakness. When the blizzard finally moved past and the snow stopped, Henrik tallied his fuel consumption and realized with a sense of shock and dread that he had burned nearly an entire cord of wood, a cord that he had cut and split with enormous effort that was supposed to last him several weeks, maybe even a month. At this rate of consumption, he would run out of fuel long before spring arrived. A few days later, when the weather had cleared enough for travel, Henrik walked to the general store in town and encountered Ole, who had traveled in for supplies. Henrik was curious and also skeptical. He had heard the rumors that Ole was using magic stones to heat his cabin, that Ole was somehow not burning wood at all, that Ole had solved the heating problem in a way that defied explanation and common sense. Hanssen, Henrik said when he saw Ole, approaching him directly. "I need to know something. During that blizzard, how much fuel did you burn? How many cords of wood?" Ole looked at Henrik carefully before answering. He understood what this question meant in a deeper sense. He understood that Henrik was asking if the rumors were true, if the system actually worked, if the strange process he had observed was actually effective. "3 large stones," Ole replied simply. "That is all." Henrik laughed out loud, a laugh of disbelief and frustration, the kind of laugh that comes from confronting something you don't understand. 3 stones. You are telling me you heated your cabin through a 2-day blizzard with 3 stones. He was convinced that Ole was either lying to him, deliberately misleading him, or genuinely out of his mind, playing some kind of game, unwilling to share his true secrets. But underneath the skepticism and the disbelief, Henrik was beginning to experience something else. Curiosity. How was Ole's cabin not freezing? How was he managing with seemingly no significant fuel expenditure? What was the man really doing out there? Over the next 2 months, as November turned into December and December moved toward January, Ole's system proved itself again and again. Every evening, as darkness fell and the temperature began to drop, the ritual continued. Ole would heat his rocks in the fire pit, working in the growing cold, tending to the stones until they reached the right temperature. His children would help him wrap them and lower them into the chamber beneath the cabin. The heat would rise through the night and into the morning, warming the living space above in a way that no one on the prairie had ever seen before. The cabin remained warm and comfortable, a place where a person could remove their heavy winter clothing indoors, where children could play without fear of freezing, where daily life could happen with something approaching actual comfort rather than mere survival. Other homesteaders began to notice and to talk about it. They would pass by Ole's cabin on various errands and observe the warm light in the windows, the absence of the heavy smoke that indicated a roaring fire constantly being fed, the apparent ease and casualness with which Ole was moving through the winter season. Men would stop by and ask him direct questions. Women would mention it to each other in conversations at the general store. Stories began to spread across the region about the mysterious Norwegian and his unusual, almost inexplicable method of heating. Then came January, 1888, and the Arctic front that meteorologists would later confirm was one of the most severe cold snaps ever recorded in Dakota Territory's entire history. The winter had been cold, certainly. The temperatures had been well below normal, and the blizzards had been intense. But this was different. This was an extreme event, a meeting of multiple weather systems in a way that created conditions of almost unimaginable severity. The temperature dropped steadily, day after day, reaching depths that seemed to have no bottom, no limit to how low the mercury could fall. The thermometer readings became almost meaningless numbers: 35, minus 38, minus 40, minus 42 degrees Fahrenheit. A level of cold that was almost incomprehensible to people who had not experienced it and could not quite be explained to those who had. At minus 42 degrees Fahrenheit, human breath freezes into ice crystals that fall like snow. Metal becomes brittle and can shatter if struck. Trees crack audibly from the expansion and contraction of frozen wood, sounds like gunshots in the silent night. Exposed flesh freezes solid in minutes. The entire prairie became a landscape of pure, extreme suffering, a place where human survival was in genuine question, where life itself seemed to hang in balance. Around the territory, families fought for their survival against the relentless cold. Henrik Peterson and his family huddled in their cabin, burning wood as fast as they could cut and haul it from their dwindling supplies, and they still could not maintain a temperature above 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The walls of the cabin seemed to generate cold rather than shelter from it. Henrik's wife, Ingrid, begged him to let them go to town, where they could stay in the boarding house and access proper heat, proper shelter, proper food. But town was 8 miles away across open prairie, and in these conditions, traveling even a few hundred yards was life-threatening. A person could become disoriented in the snow and wind, could lose their way between one fence post and the next, could freeze to death walking in a direction that felt like it was toward safety, but which was actually away from it. People had died just like that, just disappeared into the snow, and been found in spring, frozen in the wrong direction. Henrik's elderly mother, Margaret, came down with a severe cold that worsened day by day. The cold seemed to get into her chest, and her cough became worse and worse. Her breathing became labored and difficult. Henrik and Ingrid recognized the signs immediately, though they didn't want to acknowledge what those signs meant. Their mother was developing pneumonia, and in these conditions, with no doctor within miles, with no warm place to truly recover, pneumonia was likely to be fatal. They had seen it before. They knew what it meant. Henrik's youngest child, a daughter named Emma, who was only 3 years old, developed frostbite on her tiny toes from the relentless cold that penetrated into the cabin, despite their frantic efforts to seal every gap and crack with whatever materials they could find: old cloth, straw, anything to block the wind. Her small toes turned black and began to smell of infection, a smell that told a story of tissue dying, of flesh dying, of death slowly claiming a piece of this small child. Across the prairie, the story was similar in homesteads from every direction. People were desperate. Fuel supplies were running critically low. Animals were dying of cold. Children were developing illnesses that were almost certainly going to be fatal. The community was suffering in a way that unified people in their shared desperation. But this unity did not translate into any practical help. Each family was focused on their own survival. Each homestead was isolated by the dangerous conditions. And yet, when neighbors would pass Ole's cabin during this terrible time, they could see warm light in the windows. The light was golden and steady, not the orange flicker of a struggling fire, but the consistent glow of a well-maintained interior. More than that, on the few occasions when people had been close enough to the cabin, stopping briefly to call out a question or check if Ole and his children had adequate supplies, they could feel warmth radiating from the walls themselves. The snow around the cabin's foundation was melting in places, revealing the earth underneath. It was a warmth that seemed impossible, given the extreme conditions outside, a warmth that defied explanation, a warmth that led some people to whisper about magic and mysteries. It was on one of the worst days of that Arctic front, a day when the temperature had dipped to a measured -42 degrees Fahrenheit, and a wind was blowing hard that made the actual wind chill, perhaps -80 degrees or worse, that Henrik Patterson made a decision that would define the rest of his life and change the direction of his family's history. His mother was dying of pneumonia, her breathing becoming more shallow and difficult with each passing hour. His daughter, Emma's toes were turning black with frostbite, becoming gangrenous before his eyes. His wife Ingrid was crying with desperation and exhaustion, having slept barely at all in days. His own teeth were chattering so hard that he was afraid they might break, and he could no longer feel his fingers or toes. He could not maintain the temperature in his cabin, and no amount of added fuel seemed to help. The cold was too great, too relentless, too absolute. The cold was winning. He was losing. He was losing everything. And then he remembered Ole and the shock of warmth he had felt at Ole's cabin door on that day weeks before, when he had stepped from the blizzard into genuine warmth. He understood that his only chance, his family's only chance, his mother's only chance, was to swallow his pride and ask for help from the man he had mocked, the man whose methods he had doubted and sneered at. He bundled his children in every piece of clothing they owned, layers upon layers, anything that would provide insulation against the deadly cold. He left his wife with his elderly mother, both of them huddled by what little fire they could maintain, both of them resigned to suffering, both of them accepting that they might not survive. He set out into the blizzard toward Ole's cabin, a distance of perhaps 200 yards across open snow, though it might as well have been 2 miles in these conditions. The snow was blowing horizontally, driven by a wind that seemed to come from some infernal source, a wind that had weight and force and intention. His eyes immediately began to tear from the cold, and those tears froze almost instantly on his face, forming a mask of ice that made it harder to see. It took him nearly an hour to cover the distance, feeling his way more than seeing, using the fence posts as landmarks, trusting that if he kept moving in approximately the right direction, kept one hand on the fence, he would eventually reach the cabin. The cold was so severe that it seemed to be slowing down everything. Time itself moved differently. When he finally saw the dark outline of the building through the white haze, through the swirling snow and the impossible cold, he felt a surge of hope and emotion that nearly overwhelmed him. He was going to make it. His family was going to survive. By the time he reached the door, he was barely able to stand. His face was white with frost that had built up layers thick. His beard was solid ice, a heavy mask of frozen moisture that made it hard to move his jaw. His clothing was crusted with snow and ice. He could barely speak. He knocked on the door with what little strength he had left. Ole opened the door immediately, as if he had been waiting, as if he had known that Henrik would come. Ole took one look at his neighbor, and without saying a word, pulled Henrik inside and helped him to the warmth of the cabin's interior. The wave of warm air that hit Henrik's frozen face nearly made him cry out in shock. It was almost painful, the sudden transition from deadly cold to genuine warmth. The cabin was warm, genuinely warm, the kind of warmth that made a person remember what comfort felt like, what it meant to be alive. Ole guided Henrik over to the floor vents that opened into the heating chamber below. "Feel," Ole said simply. Henrik, still shaking, knelt down and placed his hands over the vent. The warm air rising up from beneath the cabin felt like a miracle. He could feel heat, real heat, substantial heat, rising from underground like the earth itself had been transformed into a furnace. He looked at Ole, and in that moment, the skepticism and mockery that had defined Henrik's attitude toward his strange Norwegian neighbor simply dissolved. They evaporated like morning mist. All he felt was gratitude and desperate need, and recognition that he had been wrong, completely and absolutely wrong. "Show me everything," Henrik said, his voice shaking with emotion and with cold that was beginning to release its grip on his body. "Whatever you have done, whatever this is, I need to understand it. I need to do this. My family is dying." Ole spent the afternoon showing Henrik how the system worked. He guided him through the underground chamber, explaining about the heating stones, about the underground chamber itself, about the careful engineering of airflow and heat radiation. He showed Henrik the fire pit where he heated the stones, and explained the technique for determining when they were at the correct temperature, how you watch the color of the stone in the firelight, how you listen to how the fire sounds around it, how you develop an intuition for heat that comes from experience and observation. He spoke about his grandmother Ingrid in Norway, about the family knowledge that went back generations, about the understanding that heat could be stored and used efficiently, that thermal mass was not magic, but physics. "Come inside," Ole said, and guided Henrik into the warm cabin, where Margaret had prepared hot food, where Anders was tending the fire, where the temperature was warm enough to be genuinely comfortable. "I will show you everything. I will teach you what my grandmother taught me, and in the spring, we will build a system for your cabin as well." By that evening, as the Arctic front raged outside and the temperature continued to plummet, Henrik and Ole were sketching plans in the dirt floor of Ole's cabin, working out the dimensions and angles, discussing how Henrik could build a similar system for his own home. The planning was detailed and careful. Ole explained each element, the reasoning behind each choice, the consequences of getting any particular element wrong. Henrik asked if Ole would help him, and Ole agreed without hesitation, understanding that in the moment of being asked to share his family's ancestral knowledge, something fundamental had shifted. The knowledge his family had guarded and passed down for centuries, knowledge that had been kept as a family secret, was now being shared, spreading beyond the walls of his cabin and into the broader community. Ole seemed to understand that this was right, that the purpose of knowledge was not to be hoarded but to be used, and that in sharing what he knew, he was honoring his ancestors and ensuring that his family's wisdom would live on and flourish in this new land. The following spring, when the weather finally warmed and construction became possible again after the brutal winter, a remarkable transformation began across Dakota Territory. The winter of 1887 to 1888 had been so severe, and its consequences so dire and so visible, that everyone in the region had been forced to confront their own vulnerability, their fragility in the face of extreme weather, the fact that nature was more powerful than any human preparation or determination. Those who had not died, and there had been deaths across the territory, including Henrik's elderly mother Margaret, who did not survive the pneumonia despite the family's eventual access to Ole's warmth. She had been too weak, had survived because they had learned to value life and survival above pride, above skepticism, above the stubborn insistence on doing things the way they had always been done. 7 families, all neighbors of Ole's or neighbors of neighbors, began building their own underground heating systems in the spring and early summer of 1888. Some built them exactly as Ole's was constructed, following his specifications and his guidance with careful precision, wanting to replicate success exactly. Others, as their confidence grew and as they understood the underlying principles, modified the design based on their own homesteads and their own specific needs. Henrik Petersen, working closely with Ole, built a larger system that incorporated 2 separate chambers so that he could rotate the heated stones and maintain more consistent heat throughout the night, extending the benefit of the heat. By the end of the 1888 construction season, heating chambers using the thermal mass principle had been installed in multiple cabins across the region, spreading Ole's knowledge and transforming how people lived. Local newspapers in the larger towns, which had largely ignored Ole's strange project when it began, now began to publish articles about the Norwegian heating innovation that was allowing families to survive winters on a level that had previously been impossible, transforming what was once seen as a ritual into what was now understood as technology. One article in the Dakota Times, published in March of 1889, carried the headline, "Foreign Knowledge Proves Superior to American Improvisation. Norwegian Heating Method Revolutionizing Frontier Life." By 1890, just 3 years after Ole had first begun his construction, over 30 homesteads in the region had implemented some version of the system. By 1895, the technique had spread into neighboring territories. By 1900, thermal mass heating was becoming a recognized strategy in cold climates across the northern frontier. Ole's children grew up surrounded by this transformation, watching their father's knowledge spread and take root in the broader community in ways that changed the region forever. Margaret, who had worked alongside her father during the construction of the original system, showing a natural aptitude for the engineering and the physical work that would have been forbidden to women in the old country, eventually married a neighboring farmer named Niels Sorensen in 1893. She was 22 years old at the time, and Niels was 26, a man who came from a Swedish family and who had been taught by his own family to respect inherited knowledge and traditional skills. Together, they established a homestead about 4 miles from Ole's original claim on land that was just as harsh and just as cold. And there, they built an even more sophisticated version of the heating system. The system that Margaret and Niels designed incorporated multiple chambers that were positioned at different depths and orientations, along with a more complex ventilation system that used temperature differentials to create natural circulation patterns of warm air. Margaret bore 5 children, 2 daughters and 3 sons, and all 5 of them grew up learning the heating system and its principles as naturally as they learned to walk and talk, as naturally as they learned to speak Norwegian and English. 3 of them, her sons Eric, Otto, and Samuel, showed particular aptitude for the work and particular interest in understanding the principles that made it function. When each of them established their own homesteads as they came to adulthood, when each of them claimed their own land and built their own homes, they built the heating systems that their mother had taught them about, incorporating their own innovations and improvements based on their deep understanding of the underlying physical principles. Anders, Ole's son, took a significantly different path in life from his sister. From childhood, he had been fascinated by the scientific principles underlying the thermal mass heating concept, asking detailed questions about why the system worked, reading any books he could find about heat and physics, trying to understand not just how to build the system, but why it functioned as it did, what the deep principles were. In his late teens and early 20s, he began corresponding with engineers and professors from the University of Minnesota, intelligent men who were curious about this practical thermal mass system that was being used with remarkable success on the Dakota frontier. He created detailed diagrams showing the exact dimensions of the chamber, the precise angles of ventilation, the calculated heat transfers happening at different times of day and night, the variations by season and by temperature. His letters and diagrams, which explored with considerable sophistication the thermodynamic principles of heat storage and transfer, the way heat moved through different materials, gradually began to appear in technical journals and engineering publications. Anders never became an engineer in the formal sense. The education and certification systems of that era did not easily accommodate homesteaders from Dakota Territory, people without formal schooling or family connections in academic institutions. But his work contributed substantially to the growing scientific understanding of thermal mass as a legitimate and important heating strategy. When engineers and building scientists began to formalize the concept of thermal mass in the early 1900s, when they began to write about it in textbooks and academic papers, they were often building on observations and measurements that Ole Hanssen had carefully recorded on the Dakota frontier. His contribution to the field was recognized only posthumously, long after his death, but it was real and significant. Ole himself lived to be 81 years old, dying peacefully in his sleep in 1932, at a time when the frontier era was already becoming history and nostalgia, something that people told stories about rather than something that they actually lived anymore. The cabin he had built with his own hands and tools, and the heating system he had designed and constructed with such remarkable care and precision, remained functional long after his death. The cabin was passed to his descendants, though they did not continue to live in it. By the 1930s and 1940s, the frontier homestead lifestyle had become obsolete, a relic of an earlier era, and people had moved to towns and cities where there were modern conveniences and modern heating systems powered by furnaces and electricity. Visitors to the homestead in the 1940s and 1950s, after the cabin had been formally abandoned and left to weather the harsh elements of Dakota, reported that the underground chamber was still intact, that the stones were still positioned exactly as Ole had placed them decades before, that the entire structure had held up remarkably well to 50 or more years of weather and neglect. The cabin itself has since been lost to time and weather, dismantled by subsequent owners who wanted to salvage the log timber for other projects or destroyed in a fire set by careless travelers, the exact details now lost to history. But the memory of Ole's innovation persisted in the oral histories of the region, in the stories that grandparents told to grandchildren around kitchen tables on long winter nights, in the family traditions and family knowledge that continued through multiple generations. In the ancestral village of Hamar in Norway, in the Innlandet region where Ole's family had lived for countless generations, there is a small but significant museum dedicated to the history of emigration from the region to America. Within that museum, carefully preserved behind glass, there is a collection of letters written by Ole Hanssen back to his sister Marta, who remained in Norway and never emigrated, describing the heating system he had built and the principles it was based on. These letters, written in Norwegian with detailed descriptions of his work, have become treasured historical documents. Local historians in the village have connected these letters to earlier references in parish records from the 1600s and 1700s describing similar heating systems being used in the region, demonstrating that Ole was part of a continuous tradition stretching back centuries. A photograph from 1910 shows a cross-section diagram of Ole's heating system, hand-drawn by Anders Hansen and preserved by a neighbor and friend. This diagram demonstrates a level of engineering sophistication that was far ahead of its time, with careful calculations of chamber dimensions, careful specification of stone types, and precise ventilation requirements that show deep understanding of thermodynamic principles. What Ole Hanssen was doing, without using the modern terminology, was implementing what modern sustainable and off-grid living advocates call thermal mass heating. The same principle that allows Earthship homes to regulate temperature with minimal external energy input. The same principle that guides passive house design. The same principle that allows ice hotels in the Arctic to maintain their structure through intense heat from the sun without melting. But Ole was not working from theory or abstract principles, not from scientific papers or engineering textbooks. He was working from the inherited knowledge of his family, refined and tested through centuries of surviving in one of the harshest climates on Earth. He was taking the wisdom of the mountains, the wisdom that his great-great-grandfather had used to keep his family alive during famines, the wisdom that his grandmother had pressed into his young mind, and translating it into the language of the prairie. He was proving that knowledge doesn't belong to one place or one time. Knowledge belongs to all times and all places if we understand its principles deeply enough. The greatest lesson that Ole's story teaches us is not necessarily that ancestral knowledge is always superior to modern understanding, though in this particular case it certainly was, but rather that wisdom exists in many different forms, and that the person who dismisses the knowledge of their ancestors as superstition or ritual, as the product of ignorance or desperation, is often the person who must learn the hardest lessons. Henrik Peterson's journey from skepticism and mockery to genuine humility, from openly mocking his neighbor's strange rituals to desperately asking for instruction and help, is a journey that most of us will need to make in one form or another. The world is changing faster than we can process. And many of the solutions that we think we need to invent have already been invented by people who lived in circumstances where invention was a matter of survival, where failure meant death, not merely inconvenience. Ole's system worked not because it was magical, not because it violated the laws of physics or transcended nature, but because it worked with the laws of physics, understanding heat transfer and thermal mass in a way that was intuitive and natural to someone raised with this knowledge from childhood. In this era of expensive heating systems and climate change, and the urgent search for sustainable solutions that don't damage our world, perhaps the greatest innovation is not finding something completely new, not inventing something that hasn't existed before, but remembering something old. The rocks that Ole heated and buried beneath his cabin more than 100 years ago are still teaching lessons to anyone willing to listen, anyone willing to learn. They teach that the solutions to our problems are often hiding not in the future, not in technology yet to be invented, but in the past, in the accumulated knowledge of those who came before us, in the wisdom that was paid for in blood and tears, and the hard-won understanding of survival against all odds. When we honor the knowledge of those who came before, when we truly listen to the stories of our ancestors and understand the principles they developed, when we value the lessons they learned through their struggles, we gain access to wisdom that is tried and tested, proven through centuries of application in the harshest conditions that humans have ever faced. Ole Hanssen proved this on a frozen prairie in Dakota Territory, and the proof remains in the stories that his children and grandchildren told, in the heating systems that spread across the region and beyond, in the letters that were written and preserved in archives, in the memory of a people who learned that the oldest solutions are often the best ones. The truth that Ole discovered, that heat can be captured, stored, and released, that the earth itself can be a partner in human survival, is still true today. Until next time, stay curious, honor those who came before, and never underestimate the wisdom hiding in your own family history.